And it is really good. It's an honor to be back. Like she said, I was here in 2012, and as a kind of recovering entrepreneur, I am very aware of how difficult it is to make something survive, even for a couple of years, much less 7 to 10 years. And I think to see it not just survive, but also thrive, the magazine, the conference, and grow into something that is considerably more intimidating to speak in front of than when I was here last, is incredibly impressive. So I really commend the whole staff that made it possible, and all of you that are here today. I'm really happy to be back. So something that I've learned about myself, which I'm not sure is a good quality, is that I really kind of love bad people. I love scammers, I love hackers, I love thieves, arms dealers, people who faked their own death and left their family behind, crooked cops, mercenaries, drug dealers, arms dealers, assassins. And maybe love is too strong a word. I'm fascinated with these kinds of people. I can spend a lot of time thinking about them, and I'll very happily sort of pick up and leave my family and fly across the world to meet one of these people. And I'm saying people, but let's be honest, they're mostly men. They're almost all men, these terrible people. And I can sit down across from them, and I can listen to them for a long time, hear their stories without judgment, or at least without judgment in the moment. And I can go home and spend even more time thinking about them, and then I can try to formulate their stories into something that I can write that would be consumed by other people. And the question that I'm here to talk to you about today, or at least think through today, is why? Why am I so fascinated with these people? And I don't mean that just in a kind of therapeutic sense for myself, although this is a healing conference, so if I can get some healing up here, I'll certainly take that. But I mean for you also, as people who tell stories and people who consume stories, why are these people worth your time? There's so many stories in the world. Why do you want to hear about them? Why do you want to read about them? Why do you want to potentially tell their stories? To put it another way, what can we learn from the worst people among us, in some sense? So that's what I want to talk about. But first, let's meet some bad people. Yep. There's one. This is Joseph Hunter. His nickname, his honest-to-God real-life nickname is Rambo. That's what his friends called him. Some of his friends called him White Kong. He's a former American soldier. He was in the Special Forces. He was highly trained, highly decorated. He served in the U.S. military for 2 decades. When he left, he was not very good at adapting to civilian life, so he became a security contractor. I don't know if you are familiar with the concept of a security contractor, but basically it's a private security personnel, usually recruited ex-military kind of people who are often used to protect executives, government officials, places, dams. But in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, they were used by the military extensively to sort of fill in, often in times that they didn't want soldiers to be put in harm's way. So Joseph Hunter, as a contractor, served in Iraq, was involved in some pretty harrowing things. And then he left the contracting business, and he became a kind of roving mercenary assassin for hire. And I know this because in 2013, Joseph Hunter was arrested in Thailand. This is the Thai police picking him up on behalf of the U.S. government, and he was arrested for plotting to murder a drug enforcement agent, a U.S. drug enforcement agent, using a team of assassins in Liberia for a price of $800,000. And one of the things that never sort of ceases to be funny to me is this photo. This is like the second Homer Simpson appearance this morning. But when he was arrested, he was wearing this shirt. I don't know if you can see it that well, but it has a picture of Homer Simpson on it, like in his underwear on the couch drooling, and it says Springfield Unathletic Department. And this guy's like a trained, like hand-to-hand combat MMA fighter, and this is like his image that was projected all over the world. the point of that partly is like it's okay to laugh at these people sometimes. Actually, my editor later, one of my editors bought me this shirt, found a copy of this shirt and bought it for me, but it's sort of too weird for me to wear anywhere. But in any case, Joseph Hunter is exactly the kind of bad person that I'm very curious about. I mean, how did someone go from serving their country in a decorated manner for a number of years, decades, and then just a few years later is plotting to kill an agent of that same country for money? So I started looking into it, and as it turned out, Joseph Hunter was not actually just a roving assassin willing to kill for money. He actually had a boss, and the boss was this guy. This is Paul Le Roux. Paul Le Roux, as Andrea said in the introduction, is the subject of my book. And Paul Le Roux is a computer programmer. He was born in Zimbabwe, raised in South Africa, and he took to computers as a young kid. He got his first computer when he was 13. I think his dad gave it to him as a reward for washing the family car. And he was a natural at programming. He ended up quitting school, left home at 18, moved to London, made his way in the software industry. And in his mid-20s, he actually wrote the underlying code of a very famous piece of encryption software called TrueCrypt. If there are any encryption heads in the audience, you'll know it. It was used to secure disk drives and laptops against government intrusion or just to protect your secrets. And even to this day, the NSA supposedly has been unable to break it. But unfortunately, maybe for Paul and maybe for the rest of the world, he never made any money making this encryption software. He actually gave it away for free. And so in 2004, he decided to launch something of a more lucrative venture, which he called RX Limited and was based in the Philippines. And RX Limited sold pharmaceuticals to customers in the US. And not just any pharmaceuticals, but painkillers. Painkiller pills, some of which were opioids and some of which weren't. And it was a kind of a genius idea, business-wise and technically. He recruited American doctors and American pharmacies, so if you placed an order on one of his websites, it looks something like this. You could go there and place an order for, say, tramadol, which is a painkiller, and your order would go to an American doctor who would fill out a prescription based on what symptoms you would put in. That prescription would go to an American pharmacy who would fill the prescription. Electronically, it would go to the American pharmacy, and then they would use RX Limited's FedEx account to send the drugs right to your door. And this was, as you can imagine, dubiously legal. It was, let's just say it was a legal gray area. There's still some disagreement on whether it was fully illegal at the time. And the one thing it was it was incredibly lucrative. It was more lucrative probably than even Paul Le Roux had ever imagined. He made hundreds of millions of dollars selling painkillers to American citizens, hundreds of millions of doses, possibly billions of doses of these drugs. And so, Paul Le Roux is, he's the kind of figure that is sort of like made in a lab for me to want to go find out more about. But at first when I tried to, he was a little bit of a ghost. This photo, this kind of blurry photo, was the only photo when I started my reporting that existed of him. He was very good at staying off the internet. These websites, he had thousands and thousands and thousands of them hidden behind dozens of shell companies, using multiple identities. Some of the people who worked for him didn't even know his real name. They only knew that he was a powerful businessman, or they knew him by one of his aliases. He had diplomatic passports that he'd obtained from other countries. So that's part of why it took me 5 years to figure it all out. But what I eventually learned was that what Paul Le Roux had done was he had kind of taken his business fortune that he was making in pharmaceuticals, and he had sort of leveraged it into what you might call like a multinational criminal conglomerate. In the financial world, they would call it, diversifying. He diversified into basically every kind of crime that you can think of, and that included drug trafficking at a large scale. This is a yacht of Paul Le Roux's that washed up on a reef in Tonga with $100 million in cocaine inside. of cocaine inside and also a dead body. He bought tons of methamphetamine out of North Korea, where it's manufactured in its purest form. He dealt arms of all types in many parts of the world. He had a militia in Somalia. It's kind of a long story, but it was under the guise of a tuna fishing operation, which actually is not that bad of an idea, but it was really a scheme to develop his own kind of location where he could operate with impunity. And he had ultimately thousands of people working for him all over the world. He had call centers that were used to fuel his customer service for his pharmaceutical company in the Philippines, in Israel. He had an office in Romania with programmers I'm going to try to pronounce the Timișoara. It's like 500 kilometers to the west of here, where he recruited programmers to work on the back office of a lot of his operations and sometimes even more sort of sinister elements of it. So as he built this empire, the question was, of course, how did he end up crossing paths with someone like Joseph Hunter? And the answer was that, eventually in these businesses, you need protection. You have to protect your interests. You're running up against a lot of other sinister people. And so he began hiring security contractors from the UK, from South Africa, from Israel, and from the United States to at first protect his interests and then to threaten his business rivals and eventually to intimidate and murder people who he felt had betrayed him or people who owed him money or people from whom he wanted to extract something and they wouldn't give it up. So that's where sort of Joseph Hunter came in. And by the end of my reporting, I discovered that Paul Le Roux had a hit list, and he didn't get to everyone, but he had people, he had journalists on that hit list, he had judges on that hit list, he had people who owed him as little as $1,000, which is, again, he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was willing to have people killed who he believed had stiffed him for less than $1,000. So I started sort of thinking about Paul Le Roux as kind of like a alternate world version of a modern tech founder, the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Elon Musks of the world, or Travis Kalanick of Uber, sort of potentially brilliant, either in technology or in business, gifted, sort of nerdy people who had the ability to change the world. And those guys had kind of gone down one path, and they had sort of built these world-changing companies. And Paul Le Roux had gone down this other path, and he'd built this kind of mirror image unicorn, to use the phrase from yesterday, on the other side of the law. And truly he sort of had, his company in 2008 was worth more than Facebook was worth. He was making more money than Facebook in 2008. And so I thought of him as kind of like on this other side of the graph from those people. And so I decided to write a book about him. And the journey to kind of like feed my obsession with Paul Le Roux, it took me all over the world. It took me to the Philippines, where he was based, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Israel, Brazil, all over the US. And I encountered all kinds of people, literally hundreds of other people who in some way ended up enmeshed in this network, in this business. And these people were sort of endlessly fascinating to me as well. There were people like this guy who I won't name who worked at a call center for Le Roux in the Philippines. And one year he's managing this call center with 200 people. It's basically a room full of people on headsets answering questions about people's credit cards not working when they ordered their drugs. And the next year he's traveling to Iran to broker an arms deal between Paul Le Roux and the Iranian government to sell them missile technology. And the journey that this guy went on was sort of as fascinating to me as the journey that Paul Le Roux went on to get from where he started to where he went. Incidentally, the missile technology was actually being developed by some very talented Romanian programmers who Paul Le Roux had imported into the Philippines from here. There was a DEA investigator, that's her on the left, who was sitting in her cubicle in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when she came across one of those websites and subpoenaed the FedEx account and discovered this volume of drugs that was being shipped all over the United States from these pharmacies. And then she spent the better part of 6 years trying to figure out who was behind it and get anyone at the DEA to pay attention to what was happening. There was this guy, who I also won't name, and who's like actually kind of nicer than his picture might imply. When I first went to interview him at his office in Manila, when I sat down with him, the first thing that he told me was in some detail how he would have killed me if he had decided to do that instead of taking the interview. Exactly who he would contact, how much it would cost, and how much my life was worth to him. That's the first thing he said to me, and I think I had like my hippocampus shut down in that moment. But then later I listened to the tape, and it turned out I had said, "Don't do that." That was my courageous response to his implicit death threat. But this guy was actually very interesting to me because he's also, as the photo might imply, a security contractor of some note. And he had turned down Paul Le Roux. He had said, "I've done some shady things in my life, but I'm not working for this guy. This guy's trouble." And his deputy actually did go become the head of Paul Le Roux's security team, and he ended up dead. And then, there were victims too. There were people who had inadvertently almost ended up in Paul Le Roux's world. And this is Catherine Lee, and she was a real estate agent in the Philippines who Paul Le Roux had murdered, or orchestrated by Joseph Hunter for taking a commission on a real estate deal that fell through. That was her, crime in Paul Le Roux's eyes. So, these people became kind of the engine of my reporting and kind of the engine of the book. The choices that they made and how they ended up in places that they didn't expect. And some of them made moral compromises along the way. Some of them in law enforcement had their own motivations that were not necessarily the ones that you would hope for. And then there were some like Catherine Lee who were the victims. And then even among some of that group, there were people who had been part of the business and just were trying to get out. So I'll tell you about one more. And this is, I'll call him Marcus. That's not his real name, but that is what Paul Le Roux called him as well. Marcus, this is Marcus's LinkedIn page, as you can see. Believe it or not, that's how I found this man. Paul Le Roux had a company called Southern Ace, and he did a lot of his sort of dirty business through this shell company called Southern Ace, including his whole Somalia operation ran through Southern Ace. So at one point, I just thought, well, maybe I'll just type Southern Ace into LinkedIn. And sure enough, this guy had included it on his public profile. And I thought, oh, it can't be the same company. And so I sent him a message, a LinkedIn in-mail message. And he responded right away, and he said, I really should take that off my resume, which I agreed with, that he should have done that. So, and he did actually. I don't think his LinkedIn page is still active. But Marcus, he didn't really want to talk about what he had done for Paul Le Roux. He said, I could really get in trouble for this. So it didn't really get any further at the time. But then a couple years later, I discovered who he had been, which is he had been Paul Le Roux's sort of personal hitman. And by that I mean that if Paul Le Roux wanted to kill someone inside of his own organization, he needed someone that no one knew, and that was this guy. And he's from South Africa. He's a former police officer in South Africa. And when I found this out, I called him up, I got him on the phone. I never got to meet him in person. And I said, look, we talked before, but now I've heard all these things about you, and I heard you killed this person and this person, and these are the details I heard. And he said, yeah, mate, that's me. Yeah, I did those things. And then he proceeded to talk about them in a way that made me feel like he had clearly never talked about them to anyone. And, I asked him if he thought about it, if it bothered him. And he said, yeah, I think about it all the time. And he actually said, it ruined my life. I lost my wife after that. All the money that Paul Le Roux paid me is all gone. I went bankrupt. And he said, I think karma sorted me out for that. I don't want to go to jail, but I think karma really sorted me out. And then he said that he didn't really view the people involved as innocent victims. He said, they were involved, like they were in the game. And Paul Le Roux told me that they had stolen from him, and so he was the boss, and I did what he said. And then he said this thing that was really probably the most chilling thing I've heard from another human being in some sense. But he said, I was a police officer in South Africa, and in the old days, under the old government, that's what we did. We were authorized to shoot someone if we thought they had stolen or killed, robbed someone. And that's what we did. We were the executioners. And then he said, mate, I have to finish my laundry, so I gotta go. And he hung up. And that was the last time I talked to him. So the theme of this weekend is healing. And I think a valid question would be, where is the healing in telling a story like that? Marcus or Joseph Rambo Hunter or Paul Le Roux. Aren't these people just evil? Aren't they psychotic? What's the point of listening to them or even really knowing about them? And I think about and thought about these questions pretty often, and I tried to use them to sort of animate my writing. And the first thought that would always come to mind is, not every story has to change the world, so, for the better. So, and that's partly because I think a lot of you will know that, sometimes you tell a story that you think is going to change the world and then it doesn't. And sometimes you have a story that you have no intention of it doing that and then it has some effect. So it's very difficult to predict. And stories can be entertaining, they can be crazy, they can be mind-blowing. There's lots of reasons for stories to exist. Now, that might not be enough, I think. I think that might not be enough in the case of there being victims that you're talking about, where the case where people really got hurt in some way. You can theoretically imagine, and I've done these, a heist story where you're sort of like, all the bank's money got stolen, but they're insured, so we'll just tell this for fun. But I think you need a little something more when it comes to stories that are particularly dark. So, and by the way, I should say, I respect people absolutely who say, like, I don't have time in my life for a story like this. I want to hear victim stories only, and I want to hear happy stories, or this is not where I want to spend my time. So I'm not trying to guilt anyone into appreciating this type of story as much as I am trying to justify telling them. And I think ultimately I've come up with sort of two other thoughts about why it might be worth your time. And the first is that at their best, this kind of story, it's not just about the Paul Le Roux of the world, these people that have done these terrible things, but they can illuminate the systems that allowed them to flourish. So in the case of Paul Le Roux, it's not just a story about a guy who built an empire and then he did like the craziest shit you've ever seen. It's about the opioid crisis in the US, and it's about a 15-year-old kid in their bedroom in Wisconsin who could order unlimited supplies of tramadol on the internet and have it delivered to their front door, and why that was possible at the time, why no one was paying attention. It's a story about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the legacy of using private military contractors to carry out those wars, and what happens to those people when you set them free in the world and they're now highly trained and potentially morally compromised because of what they've been asked to do, and where do you think that some of them are going to end up? It's a story about corruption in the Philippines, where Paul Le Roux was able to buy judges and police and government officials, and that same corruption, just a few years later, led to the rise of a president who now has extrajudicially murdered tens of thousands of people in a supposed war on drugs, combating exactly the kind of sentiment that Paul Le Roux himself was exploiting. And I don't want to spoil the ending of the book because I, of course, would love if you all buy the book, but it's also about the American justice system. It's about, or any justice system, who gets pursued and who doesn't, who gets a deal and who doesn't. What does it mean to prosecute something like the war on drugs all over the world in any country with sort of unlimited leverage? So I think those questions can be illuminated, and hopefully I did. But I think any story about someone horrible also can bring to light the system that allowed that horrible person to thrive. And then the second reason, and I think this is probably closer to the reason why I'm personally so fascinated by these people, is I think that people who commit these bad acts can be a kind of conveyance mechanism to understand morality. Not just their morality, but also our morality. And I don't mean that in the most sort of like pat sense, like we're all in this room just one step away from becoming an assassin, or assassins, they're just like us. But I mean that the people who have made these kind of aberrant choices can give us a window into understanding motivations, human motivations, desires, impulses. And one of the strangest and most surprising things in my reporting was that a number of the people like Marcus, although I don't know about Marcus specifically, who I interviewed, who I found, I worked for years to find, thinking they would never talk to me. They were actually weirdly thankful that I was telling their stories because they had never talked about them. They were sometimes confused about why they had made the choices they had made, and they were ashamed of the choices they had made. They'd never gotten caught, so they'd never had to face any consequences for them. But that, to me, highlighted the fact that when you look at any sort of crime or evil act from a distance, you can sort of describe it that one way, evil. So you can look at Paul Le Roux and be like, he's probably a sociopath, he's evil. And you might be right. But if you look closer, you can see the steps that he took to arrive at that destination, and all of the people involved, and all of the little compromises they made that seemed meaningless to them at first, and then ultimately landed them in the place where they made a fateful decision to do something terrible. So you can find that path also reflected in the world around you. And remember, I said at the beginning of the book, I kind of thought of Paul Le Roux as this like mirror image of these tech moguls. Like, they went this path and he went this path. And by the end, I didn't really think of him that way. I thought of him as existing on the same curve as those people, the Facebooks and the Ubers of the world. Now, granted, his was a much more extreme version of that, but the idea of taking a sort of amoral approach to your business practices in order to fuel growth of your corporate empire is something that we're seeing all around us. And so recognizing that, I think, is something that's potentially valuable. The difference between Paul Le Roux and what's happened with Facebook, if you look at elections or genocides or any of the things that we're talking about now, is a difference in severity. It's not a difference in kind in terms of how people are approaching what they put out in the world. So I guess the thought that I want to leave you with is, and I'm not going to say this is like an uplifting way to send you out, is the unfortunate reality is that our lives are affected by people like this. Sometimes our countries are governed by people like this, people who have followed the siren song of their worst impulses. And I think that, not to be too grandiose about it, but I think one way that we can hope to constrain those people is to recognize them for what they are and to try and understand them better than they understand themselves. So there's a postscript to the story about Marcus, which is that that thing I told you, which I think about all the time, that thing he told me about being a police officer and being granted that authority in the old regime to just kill people, is not actually in the book that I wrote. I put it in, and then my brilliant editor, Andy Ward, who's also Luke's editor as well, he took it out, and I put it in, and they took it out. You know how these things go. And then in our last meeting, we're going over the last changes, I had put it in again, he'd taken it out again. And so I was there sitting with him, and I said, Andy, you know, it's really stuck with me. Like, I think this is really important. And he said, no, I see what you're saying. And I made many of the arguments that I've just made to you about why it could be important. And he said, no, I hear you, but, you know, man, sometimes there's just only so much darkness that people can take. And so I appreciate you taking this darkness here, and I'm happy to be here. And I hope to catch up with many of you on the break. Thanks.
Thank you.